Let's minimize my screen there. So yes, welcome to this session. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm the Chief Technologist at Data8. So we're an ISV in the data quality space with a lot of integrations into the whole Dynamics Power Platform stack. I've been around in the area of Dynamics CRM back in the day of 4.0, 2008. So been around for quite a while, seen a lot of evolutions along this. So this is one of the biggest evolutions I think I've seen in recent years. So this really got my interest up. And as part of my work in Data8, I'm interested in all things to do with data integration, performance. I'm involved in a few community tools. So if you use things like Fetch XML Builder and XRM Toolbox, I'm a contributor to that. And I'm going to touch on my own tool, SQL for CDS, later on as well. If you want to follow up after with anything that I've mentioned, a whole bunch of contact details on there to get me on all different channels. There is a lot of content that I put on my blog there, markcarrington.dev, about this topic when this was first released. But yeah, enough about me. I'm going to crack on with what I want to see about. So a little bit of history first, I think, to sort of put what we're looking at today in a bit of context. So in the days of CRM on-premise, so taking me back to my CRM 4.0 2011 days, as a user, you would talk to the Dynamics 365, whatever, service, web service, and that would talk to a SQL database to get its data, all very nice and straightforward. You could also run reports as a user, though, so that would talk to the SSRS server. And depending on what sort of report you were using, you could do either Fetch XML-based reports or SQL-based reports. So SSRS could talk directly to the SQL database or back to the Dynamics server to get its data. So there was an option, I don't know how many people actually used it, where users could actually talk to the SQL database directly as well. I imagine not very many admins actually gave people that option. But either way, that SSRS report, any users accessing the database directly, they could access these things called filtered views on the SQL database, which would give people all the access to their data, but apply all the same security roles and everything that they would have through the application. Now, if we move to the online system, so when CRM Online was introduced, however many years ago that was now, basically it's the same structure, apart from you lose this direct SQL access. For whatever architectural reason made it impossible for Microsoft to support that. So you couldn't do SQL-based reports, you couldn't have any access to the SQL database behind the scenes. So any reporting now had to go through the Fetch XML option. And that was like that for some years until last year there was a change to CDS, where they changed the storage model to what they call the heterogeneous storage model. And that basically meant that all the data that was in the SQL database, some of that now isn't in a SQL database. Some of that's stored in blob storage, some of it's stored in Cosmos DB. Makes it a lot more efficient, certainly from a cost perspective. It's very expensive to store your data, everything in the database, especially when you're talking about large attachments. Things much more efficient to store that in a general purpose blob storage. But from a user's perspective, accessing the application, running reports through Fetch XML, that was all completely invisible. That's an important thing to bear in mind for later on. So 2 months ago now, I think, back at the Business Applications Summit, Microsoft announced this thing called the TDS endpoint. You might hear it referred to as a SQL endpoint. Now, this is basically a new layer in front of Dynamics that looks an awful lot like a SQL database, but isn't. It's just kind of pretending to be. And you can ask, you can fire SQL queries at that endpoint. And internally, that's going to fire those queries back at the Dynamics server and let it handle it. Now, because that's looking like a SQL database, it's not anything special, it's nothing bespoke to Dynamics, it's talking the same protocol as a regular SQL server. You can use any of your normal SQL database tools with that. So the two main ones people are interested in particularly, Power BI is what it was really invented for, to be able to run Power BI reports. and SQL Server Management Studio. But if you're a C# dev and you want to be integrating with it, you can fire up a normal SQL connection, and you can send your queries at that endpoint in exactly the same way as if it was any other real SQL database. So this is quite exciting, but there are a few restrictions. So it's kind of important to know really what we're getting here. You can read the CDS database, quite explicitly the database and not the other data storage technologies that have been introduced, using standard SQL. So you can't modify data, you can't do update statements, you can't do inserts, anything like that. And it is not directly accessing the SQL server. It is going through this intermediate step of sending your queries via the dynamic system. And that's going to have a few little impacts that we'll see later on. So why is this so exciting to say? This is probably the biggest change that I've seen to the platform in quite some years. So we've been restricted to being able to run queries using fetch XML language for some time. So fetch XML is probably a bit more powerful than a lot of people give it credit for, but it is still kind of restrictive if you're coming from a SQL background. So it lets us write largely arbitrary SQL queries. Anything that you could run on a SQL database, you can run through this with a few minor exceptions. Because it's talking the same TDS protocol as SQL Server, it opens up a whole ecosystem of other tools that we can use with it. Power BI is one that we're going to look at. But I say anything that will normally execute select statements against the SQL database, you can use against this and query your live CDS dataflex. And crucially, it is live. This is talking to the database that underlies your dynamic system. It's not another copy that's sitting elsewhere and synchronized and some time behind it. It is the database that Dynamics is using. So it is a sort of a full transactionally consistent view of your data. And the final really important point is because it's the actual database and you're accessing it as a Dynamics user, it can apply that same full security model. So all your security roles, all your field level security profiles, that's all being applied to your team membership, sharing, everything's in there, so that you can see exactly the same data that you can see through the application and nothing more. So with that, I'm going to flip over to do a demo, take you through how we get this set up, how we can start running some queries and have a look at the sorts of things that we can do with it. So enabling this, when it first came out back in May as public preview, enabling it was, to put it frankly, a real pain. There was all sorts of steps you had to jump through. You had to download some extra tooling, you had to edit some XML files, you had to run stuff with the command line, which didn't work for me. Thankfully, they've moved that on a few times, so you can now enable it within the admin center. So if you go to your environment, go to the settings, and then under product and features, there's this option down here, which is to enable the TDS endpoint. So we're just going to flip that on and save that. And then instantly that's going to take effect. And if I now flip over to SQL Server Management Studio, I should be able to connect to it. Now, the crucial bits to look at here. To be able to connect to it, you're going to need your server name, which is exactly what you would use in your browser. And then after that, we're going to do ,5558. So that's the port number that this endpoint will always run on. The authentication types, you have to use one of the Azure Active Directory options. Doesn't work with Windows authentication or regular SQL Server authentication. I've got MFA enabled on my account, so I'm going to use the MFA option here. You can also use the password-based version as well. So if I connect there, I'm going to get the regular login screen. And then over on the left, I'll be able to see a few details as soon as that's connected. I didn't connect to it through there, so I'm going to do that again. So we can see here, it looks like it's a regular SQL Server connection. If we expand the list of databases, we'll only see the one database on there, which is the org that I've connected to. You notice it's read-only on there. So as I said, this is the only things you can run on here is select statements, essentially. No insert, updates, deletes. I imagine that would be on the roadmap for people to be looking at in future versions, but certainly that's all that's in the preview at the moment. If you go poking around in here, just out of interest, there's nothing more in there. They're obviously changing something because when I expanded that yesterday, that was completely empty. So they are actively working on this by the look of it. And now we can run some queries. So as a really simple example, I can select some columns out from the account entity. So each entity in your CDS database, Dataflex, is available as if it's a table by its logical name. So same for any custom entities you want. You got your new underscore cool entity name, and that'll be available here as if it's a table. And same with all the attributes you select, you can create in it. So that's nice and straightforward. So I just got a couple of string fields there, but then it get a little bit more interesting. So if we have a look at an option set value here, so we have a look at some industry details against these accounts. You see we'll actually get two fields coming out. So we've got the industry code, which is the numeric option set value, but we can also get the name out as well. And that should be localized to the current user as well. So you should be able to just run this same query for different users and get it in each user's language. For other interesting types as well, so we've got lookup values. So if we have a look at here, we're looking at the contact entity, and we can look at the parent customer ID. For each lookup one, we also get the associated name. So that's going to be the primary name of whatever it's linked to. And because the parent customer of a contact can be another contact or it can be an account, we also get this type suffix field as well. So this will tell us here, so we've got 3 contacts. These are the GUIDs of the parent accounts, and we know it's an account because we got a type code of 1 coming out here. Unfortunately, the types seem to be the object type codes, these numeric values, rather than the more friendly logical names I'm kind of more used to seeing in places now. But we can work with that for the moment. But I'm kind of hoping that might change or have another option available to us in time, because these values can change for custom entities as you move them between environments. But all this stuff that we've seen so far, we can do in Fetch XML already. But just to kind of prove that we can do more that's real SQL, we can run some functions. So I've got up here 6 accounts. I've got 6 accounts, but I can filter that by ones that were created last month by using the date part function, something you just can't do in Fetch XML. We can do joins, so a reasonably straightforward one, just joining the account to its parent contact, a contact to its parent account even. But we can add more features onto that. So this is one that you could do in Fetch XML. This one you really can't. So we're comparing columns across different contacts. So we're trying to find here essentially duplicated contacts. So we've got 2 contacts with the same full names. And we can run that, and we don't have any because I renamed one of them. But that's the sort of thing that if you were to try and do that in Fetch XML, you just wouldn't be able to do it at all. You'd have to do a lot of post-processing of the results to get that answer. You got access to all your aggregate functions that you'd expect to have in SQL. So we can have the number of contacts by account. So we've got 2 accounts that have got contacts. The rest have been filtered out by the join. And you can do some more advanced aggregates as well in SQL that you can't do in Fetch XML. So I'm using here this string aggregate. So that's going to not just tell me how many contacts there are, but it's going to actually concatenate their names as well. So you can use that to produce some sort of summary reports. And one that's a real bugbear of mine that's missing from Fetch XML, being able to filter the results using the having clause. So show me all the accounts that have got more than one account. Show me all the account names that are duplicated in this case. So there are 2 accounts, both called account 3. I don't want to know about the ones that are only in there once. Not important to me. You can do things like subqueries. So show me the name of each account and the name of one contact in it. Don't particularly care which one. So I can do subqueries like that. And in a related way, you can do more advanced things like outer apply. So I want to pick a particular contact. I want to do the most recently created contact against each account. So all this that you would be able to do if you had full SQL Server access is available to you here. Getting more advanced, you can do things like windowing functions. So you give me a row number for each one. So you can use that to maybe display nicer formatted invoices and things like that. Well, here I've got the accounts with a running total of their revenue by industry. So if we look at these here, so I've got accounting industry, and I've got one with a 17 million revenue, one with 2 million, one with 1 million, and over here I can see that adding up as we go: 17 million, 19 million, 20 million. Then it resets for the next industry, and then for the next industry. So you've got the revenue for each account individually, and then we've got a running total that resets automatically on the industry code. And you can do all this in just one query, which makes things really much easier if I can do all this at the SQL level, to then much more simplify the presentation layer if I want to actually render this out to a user for reporting. So as I said, this is in preview, and I've been able to run an awful lot of SQL queries here, and they've all kind of run flawlessly. One thing they do seem to have changed since I tried this literally yesterday was that I was getting red underlining on all these things to say that they weren't valid. They seem to have fixed that, which is fantastic. One other thing that I came across that I'm now wondering if they fixed as well. You would normally be able to run a query a bit like this. So if I want to join accounts to contacts, that should be a perfectly valid SQL query. But yeah, okay, so they haven't fixed this one yet. So if you do a join, but you don't put an alias into the table names, even though these column names are unique, it can't find them. You have to put an alias in for each of these. And that query will work as you expect. So I mentioned, because this isn't direct SQL access, it is going via that dynamic server, and it's doing something to sort of rewrite or sanitize these queries, I think, as it's going through. You do get some oddities like this, which can leave you thinking that looks like a perfectly valid SQL query. I know that's valid SQL. And there are some of these little oddities you need to be aware of when you start sort of hitting up against those errors. But yes, generally pretty sound. So one other thing I wanted to show you on demo was, so I've got, as I mentioned there, these 6 accounts. I go over to another window here. I'm logged in as a different user. I can see my 2 accounts. Now, one of the really crucial things that this endpoint does is it enforces those exact same security roles. And that's really important when we get onto using it for things like Power BI later on. So I just want to show how that works. So if I connect to this same instance again, this time I'm going to log in as a different user. And before I switch to that user, I'm going to rerun this first query up here. So you can see I've got 6 accounts here. if I just copy that same query over to this other window where I'm logged in as a different user, I can only see 2 accounts. That's because of the different security roles applied to the 2 different users. This one's just a regular salesperson user as opposed to the system administrator. And you can see here, actually, those red underlines have come back, so maybe they haven't fixed quite what I thought they might have done. So yes, if you see all these red underlines, don't be worried, your query is still perfectly valid. There's just some errors there in how it's rendering these IntelliSense things back to the within SQL Management Studio. So yes, I'm only seeing 2 accounts rather than all 6, but also notice actually it's applied field level security as well. So here in the data rate user, in the data rate account, sorry, it doesn't have an account number, whereas over here it does. That's because field level security rules have kicked in, and this user doesn't have read access to that field. So it just appears as null for everything. So eventually it will apply all the security aspects of the Dynamics model exactly as you would expect. So security roles, field level security, teams, sharing. You should see exactly the same things in here, either filtering out rows, filtering out columns. So there should be no way that any data gets leaked out through this endpoint if you turn it on, that people wouldn't be able to access through any other way. So Power BI, so this endpoint really exists for Power BI. That was, I think, why it was originally created. So without this, and before this was released, any Power BI reports that you would want to create based on your Dynamics data would be run off a local to Power BI snapshot, so you could refresh that daily or whatever. And because of that, your data, your reports in Power BI, first of all, are delayed. So if you refresh it daily, you could be 24 hours out of date on your data, which if you're doing sort of large scale reporting, what's the state of my business across a big multinational, maybe that's not such an important thing. But if you're trying to deploy this to individual users, you know, who should I be phoning today? What are my accounts doing? Where am I up to with my targets? They kind of like that to be up to the minute. You know, I just closed a big deal. Where am I at my target now? I have to wait till tomorrow to find out. That's not great. And also because it had this local snapshot within Power BI, that wasn't aware of any of those security settings. What role does this user have in Dynamics? It doesn't know about any of that stuff. So either people had access to this data or they didn't really, which kind of limited how much people could make use of these reports, because generally you don't want to share all your data with everybody. So you either can't share any of it or you have to share all of it. With this, that kind of gets rid of both of those. So first of all, you're accessing live data. Power BI, when it accesses this, is ultimately accessing that live backend SQL database. And it's applying that same security model again. So if 2 different people run the same query by opening the same report, they're seeing the data that Dynamics says they should be able to see. So a quick demo of how we're going to build one of these.
Mark, can I just chip in 2 seconds with a couple of questions that have come up before you do the demo? Is that all right?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Chris asked, as far as the SQL goes, can you use case statements? Do you know?
Yes, absolutely. That's a relatively straightforward one, I think. So if we do here, so it puts out a 1 when the name starts with account, otherwise it should put out a 0. I can't spell account, otherwise that should work fine.
Good stuff. Excellent. Okay, so I imagine that's good for reports and stuff like that. Yogesh has asked, will Microsoft deprecate the data export, which I guess is the data export services, which I can kind of see where he's coming from with that.
So I'd throw that over to you. You probably have more knowledge of that than I would. So there's nothing announced about it, so that's all I can say on that one.
No, there's nothing announced. I wouldn't go crazy on data export services from now on, probably, because although there are thousands of customers using it, it has a limited lifespan because of the export to data lake functionality that is getting built out, and actually data export service hasn't really changed since, I don't know, since he introduced it almost. So there's not any investment going on in that feature anymore. So export to data lake is kind of where it's going. One more quick question, Ben Walker, any limit on the number of rows returned as there is in the fetch XML?
Not that I've found so far.
Okay, so that's 50,000 rows, right?
I'm trying to break it, but I haven't forget.
Yeah, I wouldn't be too surprised if there are limits, because obviously we're still, particularly as you're querying the data source itself.
Yeah, so I would certainly be wary of hammering it to that extent in a live production system, because you are, well, I suppose you're connecting to one of the replicas. So whether that's going to take a lock that's going to stop people updating data, I'm not sure. I believe there are enough replicas of the SQL database that it could be running this on an async always on replica behind the scenes.
Wow,
so that it's not going to cool. Other people, but that's purely conjecture on my part. Don't take my word from it.
Yeah. Okay. We have a couple other questions. I'm conscious that you want to get on with your demo. Are you okay should we park them? Or?
No, sure.
Okay. So Chris, another quick question about the SQL. Good question. Does it also support the union statement?
Yes. Union is fine. The one bit that I've managed to get it to not work on so far is common table expressions, which is a bit of a problem if you're trying to query hierarchical data. I think the best way for doing that is still with fetch XML operators at the moment. They are apparently working on getting that supported. Quite when that means, I have no idea.
Man, you are a rock star at this stuff. I can say that they are continuing to build out this feature, and it will become very rich in future, but this is kind of a version 1, probably not even a version 1, probably a version 0.1.
Yeah, this is still preview, so I imagine that hopefully some of these missed off bits will make it. I would hope CTEs would be part of that, because they are kind of so essential to doing anything hierarchical. I think anything to do with data, updates and inserts and stuff will be some way further down the line.
Yeah. Okay. One last question from Lars. Good question. Do you know if the SQL statements count as a request against the API request limits?
I don't know, but I would absolutely guess so.
Yeah. I thought that was a good question because I don't know either, but I would assume they do. Okay. Thanks for those.
Okay. So yes, I mentioned Power BI, I think, is the reason that this thing exists, simply because people couldn't use Power BI in the way that they possibly wanted to, and be able to use it as a fuller replacement for SSRS reporting. So no, I don't want to give you feedback right now. So in the Maker portal, notice up here there's Analyze in Power BI option. What this is going to do is going to download a Power BI data source option. Now, I'm not the world's greatest Power BI designer, so I'm not going to try and make this overly pretty or anything. Much better people at this than me. But this is going to allow us pull in basically any of this data from CDS. Fantastic, why isn't that working? That's the wrong instance. Start. Switch to the right instance. There we go. So yes, once you're connected here, you'll be able to pull in any of those CDS entities as parts of the Power BI data source. I have to confess that the very first Power BI report I made was a few months ago when I was testing this out. So yes, I'm sure lots of you probably have lots more experience than me on building Power BI. But I'm just going to, for the purposes of a few-minute demo, I'm just going to pull in the account data. I'm not going to do any crazy transforms or anything. I'm just going to load in the raw data. And I just want to do a really quick visualization of this, just breaking this down by industry. This is field I got populated in my little demo data set here. Yeah, man. Thank you. I'm just going to go for a column chart. So column chart on there, and say I want to have a look at the industry code. So mentioned for option sets, you've got the underlying code, and then there's the name. So I'm going to put the name on here as the legend values. And I just want the number of accounts in each one. So I'm going to look at account ID. And you see straight away in the preview there, we've got accounts broken over 3 different industries. And if I add that up, that gets me to my 6 accounts that I would expect. So I can publish that. Call that. And I'll publish that to my demo workspace. Okay, so I can open that over here and see that nicely rendered just as we saw in Power BI Desktop. At the same time though, if I switch over to my other user again, and now we'll look over here, copy that URL. I can see here, I can only see 2 accounts, and I've got 1 of each industry. So I'm logged in as a different user. I've gone to exactly the same report, just copied and pasted that URL, but it's applying that same security as we saw through SQL Management Studio. Now, just to sort of prove that that is live, I'm just going to pick one of those 2 accounts and just change its industry. So at the moment, we're seeing 1 accounting, 1 consulting. So that's the consulting one. If I move that over to accounting, you should see that immediately change now. I've got 2 accounting ones. So it's absolutely live data. No delay on that at all.
No smoke and mirrors here.
Yeah.
Thomas had a quick question on this, which is, will this be a live query every time you open the report? So just like in the old school dashboards that we have in Dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe so.
Yeah.
Where you saw there, it's absolutely live there. So unless there's other caching options in Power BI that I'm not aware of, and say I'm not a Power BI expert by any means, then yes, I would absolutely imagine this to be as live as the charts that you would, the sort of the native Dynamics charts that you would have in dashboards today. So yes, that's Power BI. It's really that easy. So I'd never written one before this was introduced, largely for the reasons that I went through before. But yes, I can see us making a lot more use of that going forward, simply because of this endpoint making it much more what users would expect. So to get down a little bit into the weeds and then maybe answer a few other questions about how it works and some of the knock-on impacts on this. I say it's not directly accessing the SQL database. It is a layer in front of that. And this endpoint is receiving the SQL query, and we know that that's then passed on to the whole CDS execution pipeline as for doing other fetch XML retrieves. So this is my best guess. There's nothing documented about this. I got no particular inside information, but I was just interested as I was trying to break it. There is an execute Power BI SQL message within CDS these days. So I think that SQL query is passed on as one of those requests. That's going to rewrite it in some way. And I believe that is using the filtered views. So if you're used to an on-premise environment where you can write SSRS SQL reports, you would be familiar with writing them against these filtered views, which applies all the user security roles. So I think CDS is then rewriting it to use those, making sure it's a nice sanitized query and not doing anything that you shouldn't. That's then going to pass it on to the SQL database to actually execute it, and it's going to pass the results back again. So some interesting knock-on effects from this is that with a little bit of guessing of parameter names and stuff, you can actually call the execute Power BI SQL request from an SDK application. So you can just give it a SQL query and you get a data set back in the results. You still have to have the endpoint enabled for that to work. This is entirely undocumented, so I really don't advise that you go and do this in anything other than just playing with it for interest, but it interests me. You can't do that from inside the sandbox, though. I thought it would be useful to be able to do a SQL query from inside a plugin. You can't do that. It won't let you do it from a sandbox plugin. And you can't attach your own plugins to that request message either to rewrite the SQL query yourself or anything, unfortunately. But yeah, that's my best guess if you're interested in what's going on behind the scenes. So some things you should probably be aware of if you're using this, and just to kind of reiterate that this is in preview, so kind of I'm not knocking it. I think this is a really good improvement on the systems that we had before for accessing the data. Firstly, you can only access what's in the database and not in those other storage methods. So you can access, for example, the annotation entity to get to notes, but the document body attribute within that, where any attachments are stored, is null for everything, because that's now not stored in the database, that's now stored in blob storage. You can't access things like audit trail and plugin tracelog because they're now stored in Cosmos DB, I believe. Those entities just aren't there entirely. No plugin support, so this isn't going through the whole retrieve multiple pipeline as other queries would do. So one important thing to call out on that really is that if you've got some crazy security requirements that mean you've got to retrieve multiple plugins to do some extra filtering of your data, they won't be called. And your users will be able to access data according to the built-in security roles, but not whatever custom logic you've put into your retrieve multiple plugin. So if you do have that sort of system in place, you basically can't enable this, certainly for the moment. I saw some slides from Inspire, I think, where this was it was promoted as having full plugin support. I think that is more of a goal rather than something that you can do today. It does need OAuth authentication to connect to it. So for SQL Server Management Studio, you need a relatively up-to-date version, and you need to use those Azure Active Directory authentication options. I have seen some mismatches between what you get back from the results if you do a select star from account and the columns that it lists in the schema. There's some extra things just appear in the results that aren't in the schema. So if you've got some code that you're wanting to use with this that's sort of fragile to that sort of thing, you might hit some errors with that if you're expecting only things that are in the schema to be in the results. Mentioned IntelliSense doesn't work, and you get those little red underlines coming up. Again, don't let them put you off. Your query probably is valid. Entity Framework is apparently not supported, but it can work in some ways. You can't build a database first model from it. The tooling expects it to be talking to a real SQL database with a lot more system queries behind the scenes rather than just running simple select statements against your data. But I think if you build a lot of that model for it, you can get Entity Framework to work to actually query the data, but it's just a lot of that upfront tooling to build the model. You'll have to do that as the more of a code first approach. And I mentioned there are some query oddities. So like if you try and do those joins without aliases, you'll get some error messages that you wouldn't expect if you were running against the real SQL database. Some alternatives. So we've already mentioned data export service. You can still absolutely use that to get full SQL database access, albeit at the expense of not having that per user security enforced for you. But as Andy mentioned, export to data lake is probably more where it's at these days. That's much more scalable. It can just be running to vast numbers of records, although it is a lot more of a steep learning curve to actually get something back out of it at the end of the day. I would also like to plug my SQL for CDS tool at this point. So this will let you do a bit of the best of both worlds between the new SQL endpoint and what I've managed to code into this. So to give you an example here, there is an option here. So SQL for CDS, if you don't know, it's a tool for XRM Toolbox, which lets you query your data using SQL. Even without this new endpoint enabled, it will try and translate the SQL as much as it can to fetch XML. But there is an option in here to use this preview endpoint. So you can still run a query that I can't translate to fetch XML. So something like one of these more complex ones down here, for example, one of these windowing function ones, you can still run that. And that's going to run against the SQL endpoint. But you can also run insert commands. So you can do inserts, updates, deletes here, as well as doing selects. So if I go back to, now I should see an extra account appear. So you can use that tool to, rather than SQL Server Management Studio, as a way to mix doing select commands and all your insert, update, delete options as well. And I think we're getting towards time, so I just want to leave my contact details on there. If you do want to follow up with any more questions, feel free to reach out to me on there. I did have a blog series when this came out in May, which went through a lot of the details of it, so you feel free to read through that. Stick any comments on there if you want to do any follow-ups. Or other than that, probably Twitter is the best place to get hold of me.
There is a question from Ben.
Sure.
Assume it will work with SSRS, but not with integrated SSRS reports in Dynamics 365.
I've not tried it. So long as SSRS can handle the authentication using the OAuth authentication methods, then yes, I would absolutely expect so.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. We'll stick around for a few minutes, but got questions. If anybody's about, if I could ask you to unmute your mic just to give Mark a round of applause for saying thank you for doing it. So if you could join me in leading Mark on that, that would be great. Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, everyone.